I'm here for the semester in the Department of Philosophy, and everybody has been so welcoming and generous with their time. I feel very fortunate to be here. Okay, well, let's get I want to begin with this case. It's a recent case that has been in the news involving this 13-year-old girl who went in for a tonsillectomy, and after surgery developed excessive bleeding. She suffered cardiac arrest and was then placed on life support. She was declared brain dead, but the family appealed to the court, stating that declaring her dead violated her freedom of religion and privacy. And the courts granted an extension until January 7th of 2014. On the 5th, the body was released to the Alameda County coroner, who then released the body to the mother. And subsequently, she was transferred to a facility in New Jersey and is now reportedly being sustained on artificial support in an apartment in New Jersey. And I'll say a little bit more later why she went to New Jersey. Another case that coincidentally happened around the same time was a woman who was pregnant and suffered brain death, and they decided to maintain her functions so the fetus could gestate for 7 weeks, and then the doctors delivered a healthy child. And this headline from CNN says she died the next day, right? So there's this sort of confusion that you very often find in newspaper articles and reports, that someone is brain dead and then they died sometime later, when brain dead is an accepted legal criteria for determining death. Now, in the Jie case, there were a lot of bioethicists who commented on the case, and Arthur Caplan was one. He wrote that and took a very sort of strong stance on the case. He said, to keep Jie's body on machines is ethically wrong because definitive brain death is death, and maintaining a corpse by artificial means is only slowing the inevitable decay and collapse of bodily remains. Medicine cannot do anything for patients diagnosed as brain dead. Unlike those in a coma or in a permanent vegetative state like Terry Schiavo, a Florida woman whose family fought unsuccessfully to keep her alive, or Ariel Sharon, the former Israeli prime minister who's been in a coma for 8 years, no one recovers from brain death. Take away the machines and breathing, and the heart stops. Keep the machines going, and the body goes into slow, inevitable deterioration in which digestion fails, skin breaks down, and the body loses control of temperature and blood pressure, as well as the ability to urinate and defecate. It is wrong for health care providers to treat someone who is dead. It is wrong for lawyers to ask judges to overrule medical expertise when it is doctors, not jurists, who know when death occurs. It is immoral in the extreme not to try to get Jie's parents to come to terms with her death. Well, I agree with some of what Caplan is saying here about certainly informing the parents about that nothing really probably can be done for this person. But it's an example of what I'm going to call ostrich bioethics. I know ostriches don't stick their heads in the sand when they're threatened, but I like the image. Total brain failure or brain death is a legally accepted criterion for determining death, but there really is a question of whether it's justified. And I think what Caplan and others have ignored is the significant challenges to the standard justification for accepting total brain failure as a criterion for determining death. I mean, I think if it was Edmund Pellegrino, the chair of the President's Council on Bioethics, who was objecting to declaring Jie dead, Caplan would be saying something different. Defining and deciding on criteria for determining death is not a strictly biological or medical matter, but involves philosophical, moral, and cultural considerations. That's what I'm going to argue here. And what we need to do is avoid the old mistake in bioethics of thinking that what is fundamentally a philosophical or axiological matter can be resolved by medicine or biology. So when he says doctors know when death occurs, I think that's making the old mistake. a pediatric neurologist who has done a lot of work on brain death, D. Alan Schumann, has even suggested that in order to obtain informed consent from prospective organ donors, the donors should be informed about disagreement over whether brain death is death, and then they could more informedly agree or disagree to donate organs. So I want to go back a little bit of history to see how we got into this controversy of whether brain death is death. So in 1968, there was an ad hoc committee of Harvard Medical School that proposed irreversible coma as a new criterion for determining death. Now, this was in response, there were advances in organ, improvements in organ transplantation and some significant improvements in the 1960s in artificial ventilation. What's interesting is the committee seemed to waffle back and forth on what the justification for accepting irreversible coma as a new criterion for determining death. Sometimes they talked about that there would be it should be considered death because there's an irreversible loss of consciousness. Other times they spoke about an irreversible loss of bodily integration. Okay, what happened then in 1970, Kansas became the first state to adopt the recommendation of the Harvard Committee. But the problem here is that you could be dead in Kansas, but alive in the neighboring state of Missouri just by going across the border because Missouri didn't accept the Harvard recommendation. So in 1981, there was a U.S. President's commission that was set up to address this problem. They were really charged with proposing a uniform statutory definition of death. And in their report, which was extremely influential in how brain death came to be accepted, not only in the United States, but around the world, they considered three different definitions of death. The first, the permanent cessation of the integrated functioning of the organism as a whole. The sort of traditional notion that death is the departure of the animating or vital principle. And a third view was that death is the irreversible loss of personhood. This became known as a consciousness-related or higher brain formulation of death. Now, the bold type there indicates the view that they ultimately accepted and how they define death. So in the explanation is that on this view, death is that moment at which the body's physiological system ceases to constitute an integrated whole. So even if life continues in individual cells or organs, life of the organism as a whole requires complex integration, and without the latter, a person cannot properly be regarded as alive. Thus, individuals with total brain failure have irreversibly lost their organic integration because the brain is necessary to integrate the functioning. The brain is kind of the control center of the organism's internal organic integration. So an artificially sustained whole brain dead body is merely a collection of disintegrated organic parts and not an integrated organism as a whole. They then propose this Uniform Determination of Death Act, which says an individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including brainstem, is dead. Now, on this view, of course, individuals in persistent vegetative state are still considered alive because they still retain brainstem functions. And there's actually, this is what they propose, a uniform statutory definition of death. There's some issues about whether they really meant irreversible as opposed to permanent, and we'll talk about that later, and also whether they meant that every function in the brain, every single neuron has to be lost. Now, on the face of it, that's what this seems to say, but if you look in the report, I don't think that they were committed to that view. The Uniform Determination of Death Act was then subsequently accepted in every state in the United States, and then has also the idea of accepting a neurological criterion has been accepted widely in the world, although there's still some places where it's not. New Jersey is one exception. They have a conscience clause in the law that allows individuals who do not accept brain death as death to have only the traditional criterion of irreversible cessation of circulation and respiration apply. And that explains why Jie McMath, is now in New Jersey because it's the one state which allows people to opt out of the neurological criterion. New York allows but does not require physicians to accommodate family views on the definition of death. There's been a rising chorus of discontent with the justification for accepting brain death as death. And the main point or claim is that the brain is not necessary for integration of the organism as a whole. This chorus became so loud that in 2006, the President's Council on Bioethics thought they ought to revisit the matter of defining death and the criteria for determining death. And what critics have pointed to are cases of postmortem pregnancy, like the Robin Benson case in Canada, where the brain-dead pregnant woman is sustained for weeks, months, to gestate a fetus, and so critics point and say, how could you say that that's a dead body? Look at all of the organic integration that's going on there, so much so that it can sustain the life of a fetus. There's one case reported in the literature by Dr. Alan Schumann, a very closely studied case involving a whole brain-dead male who was sustained for over 20 years. And this individual went through puberty and required, of course, a ventilator and a feeding tube and a heating blanket to help regulate temperature. But Schumann would also, who was one of the major critics of accepting the neurological criterion, would say that that there's so much, again, so much integrated organic activity there that he would, as he put it to the council, it's hard to find a biologist who would say that we're dealing with a corpse here or a dead organism. Critics also point to the somatic effects of total brain failure in cases of brain disconnection resulting from high spinal cord transection, and say essentially the brain isn't doing anything to integrate the organism in those cases. So why should we think that the brain is necessary for the integration of the organism in cases of whole brain death? And of course, these critics would say the artificial support is really irrelevant. That is, there are so many individuals who we don't think are dead, but are dependent on artificial support. So they don't think that the artificial, the fact that the support is artificial should make a difference. Schumann and others point to certain physiological evidence of somatic integration despite total brain failure. So there's a certain homeostasis that's maintained by different various systems of the body, elimination and detoxification and recycling of cellular waste throughout the body, energy imbalance, maintenance of body temperature, albeit at a lower than normal level and with the help of blankets, wound healing, which seems to be diffused throughout the body, fighting of infections and foreign bodies. And this is, all of these activities, I think, are pointed to as evidence of organic integration. Some other kinds of criticisms are that many practitioners, physicians or nurses, do not equate total brain failure with death. There have been some studies, surveys that have been taken, and which seem to indicate that there's disagreement among health professionals, and even their understanding of what brain death is. Artificially sustained individuals with total brain failure do not appear to ordinary people as dead. They're still warm to the touch. They appear to be stable. And as I mentioned, Schumann made the claim that he does not think that there are many biologists who are going to look at a, say, artificially sustained pregnant brain-dead woman and say that there's a dead organism there. There's too much life functions going on. So in its white paper, the President's Council And what they found was that the majority found that now admits that the previous justification of the 1981 President's Commission for why individuals with total brain failure are dead is mistaken. Such artificially sustained individuals are not just collections of organic parts without internally integrated functioning. And that's a rather startling conclusion. It's kind of, well, we got it wrong back then. Because the 81 Commission was extremely influential in causing revision in the legal definition of death around the world. So what do? Do we turn back the clock and reject the neurological criterion and return to using only the traditional circulation of traditional criterion of irreversible loss of circulation and respiration? That's what some would argue, the critics would argue. Others, the other alternative is to somehow redefine death in a way that would be consistent with the neurological criterion. And that's exactly what the President's Council did. So essentially what they did is they redefined death in terms of what it means for a human organism to cease to function as an integrated organism as a whole, and then argued that, okay, if there's total brain failure, you don't have an integrated organism. What they said was individuals with total brain failure are no longer living organisms as a whole because they have irreversibly lost the capacity to engage in commerce with the surrounding world to secure their sustenance. Because individuals with total brain failure lack the spontaneous drive and felt need to breathe and interact consciously with the world, they are no longer alive. Well, this new proposal that this is a better way to understand what it means for an organism to be integrated has also been challenged by people like Alan Schumann. And he asked questions like, why define wholeness of an organism in terms of externally directed work as opposed to internal organic integration? Why prioritize breathing over other equally essential physiological functions, such as the digestion of nutrients, elimination of wastes, and wound healing? Why is it so significant that the ability to breathe be natural and spontaneous, as many other patients that require artificial support are clearly alive? It's unclear, he says, why the actual exchange of gases across the alveolar membrane does not count as self-preserving respiration of the organism as a whole. Why must the organism have a, quote, felt need and inner drive for this form of self-preservation? And then to say only when that drive or that felt need is lost that the individual is dead. He gives the counterexample: a human fetus has neither a drive to breathe nor to consciously interact with the environment, yet it is clearly a whole living organism. And so he thinks the placenta is analogous to the ventilator and feeding tube in individuals with total brain failure. Some other criticism: since neither the loss of consciousness nor the loss of spontaneous drive to breathe is individually sufficient for death, why are both jointly sufficient? On this view, individuals, say, if they were in a vegetative state, if all of a sudden they needed to have a ventilator, they would have to then be considered dead on the council's views. So the fact that that artificial support would be added would mean that, well, the individual then lacks this innate drive and felt need to sustain itself in interaction with the environment. But, of course, the council thought that the individuals in PVS are not dead. So why, this seems almost like a trivial difference, that the only thing that's changing is now you have the individual on the artificial support to continue the breathing. When we do that for many other individuals, then we don't consider them dead. Now, I think actually the underlying problem with, and it's, I should have put problem in quotes, because in some sense I don't think it's a problem, with the council's view is that these concepts that they appeal to of vital work, felt need, and drive are not biological concepts at all, but really are metaphysical concepts. These concepts are not found in modern biology textbooks. Jointly, they are really a stand-in or functional shorthand for the metaphysical concept of the soul, or anima. Under the guise of biological talk about an organism's integration with its environment, the Council is in effect defining death as the departure of the animating principle, animating or vital principle from the body. Now, some support for this interpretation I think can be found in the transcripts. I'll just read, let's see what my time is, read some of this. That is, there's quite a bit of talk about the soul in the transcripts of this council. So if you have lost higher brain capacity, but you are still breathing independently of mechanical assistance, and your heart is beating, then yours is, as far as I am concerned, still an animated body with the anima still present. And Dr. Eberstadt. Leon Cass mentioned one thing in particular that I think might be apposite to add to our discussion, and that is the discussion of the human soul. Dr. Carson, you really get back to what you were saying, you know, about the soul, or about that part of us, when gone, no longer allows you to function as a human being. And then Professor Lawler says, so the organism can be a whole in a certain way from the traditional point of view without a soul in a way, in a controversial way, because the organism then becomes no brain and all body. And it keeps going, it keeps ticking literally. So this presents us with a problem. But Professor Mailander, who's I guess a theologian and teaches religion, he says, I find myself in the, for me, unusual position of wanting to issue a caution with respect to the language that is thought of as religious, that is to say, the soul language. So he goes on here now to sort of correct Professor Lawler's understanding of the soul, and how as long as you have a living human body, it has to have the soul. She says, last paragraph there, from my perspective, any proper understanding of soul language is such that if you got a living human body, there is a soul there, you see, and you actually don't know that the soul is gone unless and until you don't have a living human body, or whatever, by whatever criteria you determine that any longer. If it is animated, the anima is there. And then Dr. Hobart says something interesting, which I find most telling about why I'm saying this is really the idea behind what they proposed, is he says that if we could, in a gingerly sort of way, re-enter into that category of the soul, without any disposition of prejudice toward any one formulation, we might really come to some valuable insight and help our society reformulate what was meant by soul, but in a more pluralistic and more material, physiologically related description. In other words, I think that we might be offered the unique opportunity to clarify the meaning of the soul and psyche in modern terms. Would be a really wonderful thing to do, because there is a lot that is being lost by not using the word soul. Well, why all this talk about the soul on a President's Council on Bioethics? What does it have to do with the matter of defining and determining death? Does it have anything to do with it? And if it doesn't, then maybe we should reject the total brain failure as a criterion for determining death and side with Schumann and the others who, I think, forcefully make the claim that you still have an integrated organism in these cases in which an individual is artificially sustained, even though he or she has total brain failure. So, but maybe there's another option, and that is to redefine death in another way consistent with the neurological criterion. And so this is something the President's Council recognized. This is my favorite part of their report. They say there's a well-developed third position that is often considered along the other two. This third position maintains that there can be two deaths: the death of the person, a being distinguished by the capacities for thought, reason, and feeling, and the death of the body or the organism. From the perspective of this third philosophical position, an individual who suffers a brain injury that leaves him incapacitated with regard to certain specifically human powers is rightly regarded as dead as a person. The still living body that remains after this death is not a human being in the full sense. Yeah, okay, yeah, there we go. Philosopher John Lee's discusses the living organism left behind after the person has died in the following way. So advocates of a consciousness-related formulation of death do not consider such a being to be a living person. In their view, a person cannot persist through the loss of all brain functions, or even the loss of just those brain functions required for consciousness and other mental functions. What remains alive must be a different sort of being, a form of life created by medical technology. Whereas a person is normally transformed into a corpse at his or her death, technology has intervened in this natural process and has made it possible for a person's remains to take the form of an artificially sustained living organism devoid of the capacity for consciousness and any other mental function. So my view here, and I'm going to spend the rest of this talk trying to defend it. An artificially sustained whole brain dead body is no longer a living human being or person, but a kind of biological artifact created by the technology. It may be a living organism, but it's no longer a human being or person. That is, it's no longer counts as one of us. So some quick arguments here. A very simple argument, but I think a very powerful argument for this view. It involves the idea of having life support to artificially sustain a body or a decapitated body. So we can imagine this kind of case, and in fact there's some crazy Italian neurosurgeon who I just read this week wants to do brain transplants. Someone had mentioned brain transplants as a way to help people with, say, severe muscular dystrophy or multi-system organ failure. He thinks, well, we can put their head on another body. And he's proposing this at the next International Neurological Association meeting. So the problem here is that artificially sustaining a physically decapitated body is similar to artificially sustaining a physiologically decapitated human body. That is a brain-dead body in terms of the somatic integration that may remain. And what I think here is going on here, we have the live remains of a human being or person. And if we don't think the artificially sustained decapitated body should count as one of us alive, then we shouldn't think that the artificially sustained brain-dead body should count as one of us. So the idea is that brain death is death because it results in the irreversible loss of psychophysical integration. Minimally, we need to have the potential for some type of mind to exist. Now, critics of this say, bite the bullet, and they want to say that the decapitated body is still alive and therefore still counts as one of us. So Waldo hasn't died despite being decapitated, which I think is extremely implausible. But here's another argument. There were experiments involving monkeys where they decapitated the monkey, in this Dr. White, and he transplanted them to the bodies of other monkeys. Experiments, of course, should never have been done. But suppose we did this. We put Waldo's head on a bypass machine or something more sophisticated. We have that problem. Where's Waldo? Now Waldo can't be identical to both, right? Because if Waldo is identical to both, then by transitivity, then the Waldo on the right side would be identical to the Waldo on the left side. Clearly, they're two different individuals. So you can't say that. So I think, at least my intuitions go this way, right, that this is Waldo. And why is this Waldo? Well, because of the importance of consciousness to a conscious organism has no counterpart in non-conscious animals or plants. That's Bernard Goertz's view. The idea here is that human beings, or beings maybe with higher order consciousness, can live in ways that other organisms can't. You can't do the Waldo type of experiments with a tree or with some creature lower on the phylogenetic scale that is incapable of any type of consciousness. And if it's reasonable to think that we can actually live in ways that are previously impossible, maybe it's sensible to think that we can now die in ways which were previously impossible, in the sense of when we've irreversibly lost consciousness. And I think that is actually the reason all along why we've been willing to accept brain death as death, not the idea that it's the loss of organic integration. I'm not going to have time to go through the rest of this, but would this imply that individuals in persistent vegetative state are dead, since they have a permanent loss of consciousness? And the answer to this, I think, is yes and no, because in PVS there's a continuum of cases going from a diagnosis after several weeks to a diagnosis of permanent vegetative state after 20 years or something. And so the probabilities here, or the reality, is different along this continuum. And the problem, one of the problems is that we may not be able to sort of draw the line where and when. I'm going to skip some of this research, but there are two objections to this view that were voiced by the President's Council. One is that there's no way to know when the specifically human powers, thinking and feeling, are irreversibly gone from the body. This is just a problem with operationalizing a consciousness-related formulation of death. It doesn't call into question the justification itself. And so my suggestion is we can accept whole brain death now because we're sure if there's no brain function, there's no consciousness. And what we should then do is refine our ability to determine, say in the cases of vegetative state, when we can be very clear when there isn't any possibility for consciousness. The other objection is that acceptance of a consciousness-related definition and criterion would change the ordinary biological meaning of death. The idea is that it would make the death of human beings distinct from the death of other living organisms, right? The claim is death is the same for all organisms. When you say your grandmother dies or your pet dies or your apple tree dies, death should mean the same thing. But I don't think that that's the case. And it goes again back to this idea that consciousness has no counterpart in non-conscious organisms. And in a case involving vegetative state, Justice Stevens wrote that, and he's framing this comment in the context of a legal sort of definition of death, where he says that it's a serious question whether the mere persistence of the body is life as that word is commonly understood, or as it is used in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So the idea is that if we look at what life is or means in the context that we're asking this question about what is the definition, it's a legal context. And so the answer should make sense within that kind of context. Let me just, I think the President's Council's, and so the idea is that differences in metaphysical views really explain why people disagree about the definition of death. And there's also a parallel here. That is that I think a lot of people have come to think that the question of when a human life begins is not settled by biology or medicine, that it's related to different metaphysical, religious, other beliefs that people have. And there's no sort of one answer to that question. I think the same thing is going on at the end of life. Again, I actually am in favor of a pluralistic definition, although I have my particular view that I try to support in terms of what a person is and why we should consider brain death as death. But I'm aware that people may differ on these metaphysical questions. So I actually am in favor of a more pluralistic approach. And just leave you with a thought from Margaret Locke, the medical anthropologist. Okay, thank you.
And sorry, I didn't make a PowerPoint slides. I just wrote a very short response. My response includes 2 paragraphs, and the first paragraph is that I want to make sure that I understand Professor Lizza's paper well, so I want to do a brief summary of his paper. The second paragraph is my little thought regarding the very issue. So let's see. Professor Lizza argues that, this is a quote from his paper, I read the paper before, the concepts of a drive and felt need are not biological concepts at all, and therefore cannot explain in modern biological terms what it means for an organism to be integrated internally or externally with its environment. So in short, I think Professor Lizza thinks the terms used by U.S. President's Council on Bioethics on brain deaths meant to be biological, but it failed to recognize that those terms are actually metaphysical. The reflection on why brain death is death shows us that it's the notion of brain death that captures the whole definition of death, or to put it more precisely, the definition of a, quote, philosophical, quote, death. So Professor Lizza actually argues for a philosophical definition of death, and I myself have no question about the significance of arguing for distinction between the deaths of persons and deaths of organisms. when I was reading his article, an idea regarding whether we could shape a coherent belief system, a definition, and criterion of death came into my mind, or to put it in a more metaphysical but not so epistemic way, isn't there a gap between the definition of persons and the neurological criterion of death? So as I read a paper wrote by Younger says, I think that's in the Oxford Handbook of Bioethics edited by Bunny. Death is a social construct, a philosophical death as well as other notions of death embedded in different cultural, moral, religious, and political background might lead to different criterion of death, legal or neurological ones. So whichever has the power to affect our real lives. So I interpret this as saying that our conception of death is socially embedded, and this means that we cannot use a calculator or a computer program or any fixed procedure to declare one's death. To declare one's death can never be a genuine objective if we accept any not so biological definition of death. For example, how could you determine whether or when one's soul leaves the body? As I read from the paper wrote by Professor Lizza, there is a quote by Dr. Pellegrino in that transcript. He also says that I don't think that we are going to be able to discern that moment by any test that I know. Thus, in some sense, the council, the President's Council on Bioethics, that's the short for it, its redefinition of death has the advantage of not throwing away once and for all those complicated stuff, for example, those kind of mysterious stuff, soul or other similar notions. Maybe in any other different cultures there are other terms, right, that we cannot define clearly or simply reduce to scientific terms or biological, neurological, whatever. I think laymen might not accept a definition of death merely in the philosophical dimension or any other sense at all. And even if they do learn how to philosophically reflect on the definition of death, it is still likely that it won't find comfortable in accepting a so-called corresponding neurological criterion of death, which will be probably an operational one. Especially when the criterion is applied to their very significant others. Of course, it's one thing to talk about the philosophical definition of death, and it's another to talk about how people think about death. But if this is not a problem for philosophers who aim to explore the philosophical essence of any social phenomenon like death, then it might not be a problem for scientists either. So, like Bonnie said, poor philosophers, what they can do. Thank you.
I can see that there are, in fact, many physicians who work in the patient and the hospital. So I'd like to hear some comments from the physician who deals every day with such situation. So now we'll make some battle between philosopher and medical doctor, if you don't mind. So, let's have a yes, put the audio. Yes, please, yes.
I just wanted to comment a bit on Jie Yin's remarks because I think they're thought-provoking. And she asked whether there's a gap between the definition of persons and a neurological criterion of death, and I agree that there is a gap. On some views of the person, such as animalism, a neurological criterion is rejected. In Japan, where some people believe that a person has an inner spirit or self, ki, kokoro, that does not reside in the brain and remains present in artificially sustained whole brain dead bodies, they reject the neurological criterion. It's rejected by some Catholics, like Alan Schumann, who thinks that the potential for intellect and will, which he thinks is a radical potential associated with an immaterial principle, still resides in the artificially sustained whole brain dead body. So his philosophical view is something that is also affecting his rejection of total brain failure as death. And Dr. Pellegrino rejects it because he gives more of a moral argument that we don't know the borderline between life and death, and the neurological criterion doesn't provide sufficient moral certitude that a death has occurred. So the rejection of the neurological criterion can come from philosophical, religious, ethical, social, cultural concerns. What I've tried to suggest is that what I think is a widely shared concept of person that supports acceptance of a neurological criterion for death, and that this concept coheres best with our understanding of ourselves as biological, psychological, moral, social, and cultural beings. So I think that's really what we want the concept of person to do, to try to hold in a single focus these aspects of our nature. Some concepts of person, I think, do better than others, but there may be no formula for which concept does it best, or why we should not allow different concepts to reflect what Isaiah Berlin called the crooked timber of humanity. So although I have my own view, which I think is better than the alternatives I've considered, I'm open to a more pluralistic approach. The other thing that Jie Yin raised was the difficulty of sort of or whether in a sense the council, by talking about the soul, is actually doing a service to the public. And I think it is in that sense, because it's a recognition that defining death goes beyond just biology. And recognition of a truth by government, that's generally a good thing. I think that should be encouraged. But it's a bit patronizing, I think, and a disservice that the council wasn't more explicit in this. Just why not come clean on the fact? Now, there are some concerns. Robert Burt, a legal scholar at Yale, has worried about the idea that what will happen, it will be very disconcerting and polarizing, he thinks, to the public if the public sort of became aware that, or thought that there was some choice in the criteria for determining death. He thinks that it's comforting for people to think that death is not something that they have a choice about, that it's just something that happens. He thinks that the United States is lucky not to have had the debate in Japan, a quite polarizing debate in Japan over brain death. And he says the last thing we need is another polarizing debate like we have over abortion in the United States. In short, I think he thinks that it's better to tell a kind of noble lie or helpful fiction rather than the truth. And I'm really against the noble lie unless in some very narrow emergency type of situations. And I think actually the debate in Japan has been very good, healthy. I mean, it stopped some very unscrupulous kind of organ transplantation that was going on. And it also made people reflect on the technology before it just was imposed upon the people, and see whether it's acceptable given other beliefs that they have and values that they have.
Thank you. You want to make a comment? All right. So let's have a floor. The 1 and 2, and yes, 3.
Thank you for that presentation. I have a question about the significance of agreeing for us agreeing the legal definition of death. Is the significance of agreeing on the legal definition of death because it's a purely utilitarian question? Is it about the allocation of resources? That's why we have to agree? Because otherwise, I don't see why my definition of death needs to be the same as yours, unless it's about the allocation of resources. Otherwise, I don't see why we need to agree. Thanks.
Okay, next.
This is a question about the way you handled the PVS case. Well, maybe there's some potential for consciousness there, was one thing you said. But you admitted, I take it, that by the end of several years in PVS, we are on about as secure a prognosis that this person will never come back to consciousness, no matter what is developed, as we can be about really anything in medicine. When you get to that point, I take it I would think, a consciousness-oriented definition, like you support, apparently, would say that the person is dead. There's no longer a person there. But yet, on the other hand, you put in, but not artificially sustained. PVS patients do not always need to be artificially sustained, even after decades. So that person, though they've irreversibly lost consciousness, is going to still be a person because they don't have to be artificially sustained? I'd like the clarification on that.
Yeah, I have a question about your reasons for your claim brain death is death. You seem to provide two different standards. In some places, you say why brain death is death because the patients are not conscious. In other places, you say the brain death is death because the patients are not a person. It's dead as a person, even if it may be a living organism. I think that the two things are different. I personally prefer the first consciousness standard. Let me give an example. Suppose a person has a very serious injury, and it's not brain death. This guy can be conscious, can have first order desires, but his mind is just like the mind of dog, for example. He's not a person. According to your second definition, a reason or standard, he's dead as a person. But I think it's very different from the brain death patients. And they have very different ethical implications. Should we continue the life support or something like that? So just a question.
On the first question, why do we need sort of a common definition of death? I mean, for legal purposes, in determining when someone commits a murder or something, and we're going to need some sort of standard. So the pluralistic proposal is like in New Jersey, they allow people to opt out of brain death as death if they have certain religious or philosophical objection to it. What I would add to that is that people ought to be able to opt out of the whole brain criterion and accept a consciousness-related formulation of death, which would say that if they no longer have consciousness, no potential, and here I'm talking about amencia, no type of mental function, not even the awareness of the dog that the dog might have, but nothing, no sentience, right? Then that would be, and those are the three main formulations that are at play. But if the law recognized that, now people always put their hands up and say, well, it's going to create chaos. I don't think there's a lot of chaos in New Jersey. And we manage this difference in what we understand to be sort of these questions about withdrawing life support from individuals. We do allow individuals to choose and families to make decisions in those cases. So I don't see how this would be much different. I don't see how it would create much confusion. And I would want to put limits on it. I mean, I wouldn't want someone to be able to say, well, I can't do higher mathematics anymore. I'm dead. I think that would, so it is, and that's that would be a distortion of what it means to be a person. It would be too much of a distortion. So that is, we are biological beings, and just because, and so something has to be, there has to be something significantly biologically that's happening in addition to, which is connected, I think, with the loss of, with consciousness. Some things are more essential to being a person than other things. Doing higher mathematics, I don't think is. On Paul's question, yeah, it may have been a bit confusing here. I do want to say that if an individual has irreversibly lost consciousness, which is the case in some cases of persistent vegetative state, then the individual is dead. The person is gone, right? There's no. My concern is that there's some very interesting research being done with magnetic imaging studies of individuals who are in minimally conscious state and in persistent vegetative state. Some of those, there was a study by Adrian Owens in Toronto in which he took individuals who were in a vegetative state as a result of trauma for several months. And he hooked them up to the machines and said, well, imagine playing tennis. Imagine walking around in your house. And he had a control group where certain areas of the brain light up. And lo and behold, in response to these questions, these individuals who were in a persistent vegetative state, or in a vegetative state, responded. And so that, urges some caution. There's clearly some people home there. Now, there's only one case that's been reported, Adrian Owens did this case, where he says the individual was in a permanent vegetative state for 12 years. This, however, was also a case involving trauma. It's different when I think we know what caused the loss of consciousness. If it's a global anoxic injury, then it's much more clear that the brain is impacted globally. When you have trauma, there could be these, and so in this case where the individual was in the vegetative state for 12 years, he got responses from a different kind of test. So, so there's some caution that needs to be exercised here. I think there are it'd be very hard to find neurologists, any neurologist who would say if we're dealing with an individual in a vegetative state at this far end that there's any possibility at all. And certainly that, I think we'd have the moral certainty to do that. But whether you could incorporate that into a legal definition of criterion for death at this time, I'm not so sure. So some people think but there's disagreement. Some people want to say that the individual in the vegetative state is in a super locked-in syndrome, but others who study this think no, that's clearly not what's going on.
But some of those individuals that might, being very cautious, still have consciousness.
Yes.
Potential consciousness, do not need artificial life support.
Yes. Oh, the artificial life support is irrelevant. They need food. They need artificial feeding, but that's irrelevant whether they're on or not on in vegetative state. Yeah, yeah. I think, because I went through my argument against the council's view earlier. And let me come to the last question. I do want to draw the line at amencia, no mental function at all. Because, of course, as we know with the abortion debate, there's how much do you need to be a person? Consciousness? Do you need self-consciousness? Do you need rationality? Do you need all these things? What makes the issue at the end of life easier, I think, is that we're dealing here with there's no consciousness at all. It's a bright line, the kind of line that you need, I think, to implement a sort of a legal policy. Potentiality, I think, also complicates the issue when we're at the beginning of life. Good.
Well, actually, in the Faculty of Medicine, we plan to have the second clinical ethic round on the topic of the brain death, especially the pediatric setting. It's going to be in June, so it's highly relevant in terms of hear about all the comments and then the questions. So, yes, 1, 2. Anyone from hospital? I'd love to hear from someone who actually working on the patient. Would you like to have, or CK? We have actually the chairperson from the clinical ethics from our hospital and the hospital authority. So anyone? Okay, all right. So then 1, 2, and yes, 3.
Yeah, I think your viewpoint is very convincing. I'm just raising a question for you to think about. I think one way to think about whether the person is still alive or not is about the person's ability to have relationship with another being. I'm wondering, what would you think about the case of the woman who was dead, but she was still, kept on the machine so that she can, continue to support the fetus, so that eventually the fetus was born. What do you think about her condition? Would you still say that she's still a mother, supporting, nurturing the fetus, nurturing the children, the fetus who eventually become a person? And how would the person think about the relationship with the woman? Will she still, will the fetus, will the person later when he grows up think that the mother still is connected to him, even though the mother is not conscious?
So my question is this. So you are not, strictly speaking, you of course propose brain death as the definition of death, but you are pluralistic. So you're not rejecting like the traditional conception of death, that is death as like the death of the organic biological organism. But I actually agree with your definition of death, but I wonder whether you're too lenient in being a pluralistic. So what's the point of not rejecting the other conception of death? So what's the moral value of like the biological organism? So if you think that, well, if you think that there's a pluralistic definition of death, you must mean that, well, the destruction of the biological organism is somehow a morally significant event, okay? So I'm just wondering, well, why is that a morally significant event in your field? Why are you not even rejecting that as a definition of death?
It seems to me that your claim that brain death is death is an empirical claim, which based on the view that the concept of death is defined in terms of the existence of personhood, right? But I think there are some other philosophers who argue that we are essentially human organism, not person. But I think you need to at least argue against this view. But it seems to me that you haven't given any argument for this, for your view. You're just saying that many of us hold that if the person gone, then that human body is dead. But I think that is not good enough argument for right.
Okay. On the question about relationships to others, there's a wonderful story by Truman Capote called "The Light in the Window," and it involves this person's car breaks down on the road. This man and he walks along and it's a terrible storm. It's raining. He sees a light in the window and he knocks on the door. And an old woman answers the phone and answers the door and lets him in and gives him something to eat and is chatting with him about night. And she's all alone there and talking about all of her animals and her pets and how she loves being there with them and then in the morning when he wakes up and it's clear he's getting ready to leave and he realizes that he didn't see any of the pets. And so he asks the woman as he's going out, and she opens up a floor-to-ceiling refrigerator, and they're all in there. So I think that it's interesting, the Jie McMath case, the parents are here, and the case that Schumann reports involved a nurse who, where the individual was staying for 20 years, who, with brain death with children, you have to do a confirmatory diagnosis. And essentially, after the first diagnosis of brain death, she said, I'm taking him home, and brought him home and took care of him. So I think that there is a difference. If the reality here is that that individual has no consciousness or awareness, then I think you don't have this, a relationship of sympathy is possible because I think you need two conscious beings. So it's a different type of relationship. It's not like, as Alistair was saying about, we don't treat bodies or dead bodies as just trash or not having any kind of respect or feelings for it. But I don't think it's robust enough to think that it's a personal relationship if there's no person there. So I'm sorry, I deal better with one question at a time. I'm sorry, your question about why reject? Okay, yes. So these questions were maybe both related. Yes, there's a lot more I have to say about this. So I have a book where what I try to do is take on or consider these different metaphysical views. So an animalist view, which identifies the person with an animal, and I give reasons why I think that is not as good as the view that I defend. Okay, I take a Parfitian type of view of understanding the person as a phase of a human or a functional qualitative specification of the human organism, and I try to show why that view doesn't fare as well as the view that I argue for. So there is a lot, I hope there's a lot more metaphysics. But the problem and why to go for a pluralistic definition is, well, I mean, I mentioned in the comments on Jie's comments, Jie's comments, that I think the concept of person, what we want to do is try to hold in focus a number of different considerations about our nature. One is that we're conscious beings. One is that we're biological beings. But we're also relational beings. We're also social beings. We're cultural beings. So I think that I guess I'm a bit I guess I'm a little bit humble about trying to think that this particular metaphysical view solves all the problems. I can see how when we're dealing with these borderline cases, that there may be considerations from, moral considerations or cultural considerations that would give you a different picture, right? It's kind of like, if you think of the analogy with a camera, if you're trying to keep some things in focus, maybe you're not going to get it perfect. And your picture may have one thing in better focus than someone else's picture. So I'm trying to balance those elements, and that's why.
So we are on right time. The people and Professor Yin, do you have any comment? Okay, so this was the session. So please join me to thank the speaker and Discussant for this.